Mac, that's how your name is spelled in Boston, we need some help with a character intro screen for a reality show called Zero to Hero. The concept is that the producers of the show take normal people, irradiate them, and see what happens. Most don't do well, but some folks have been gaining superpowers. We've got an awesome environment painting from Ariel Costa and a comic book art direction to work with, so it should be a sweet project. We've provided a rough edit with some effects elements from our buddies at Action VFX Tempt In. It's gonna need lots of comp love to tie it all together. Can't wait to see you do your thing.
I'm super excited to get into practical effects this week. We are dealing with some virtual elements, but not what we're adding to the shot. This time around, we're gonna take elements that were shot to be foreground and add them to a background that was fabricated. Let's take a look. Believe it or not, what you're seeing here is not the final, but just the reference. What I like to do, by the way, with reference is stick it up in the corner. So I've got my reference here and the original plate below it, and the soundtrack, which I'm gonna go ahead and just turn off because we don't need to keep hearing it. And what I was saying about reference, I'm gonna show you a little trick to put it up in the corner. I will press the A key with the layer selected, Shift P, and Shift S. And so now, watch, I'm gonna go 0, tab, 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. And then, as I scale it down, it is constrained to the upper left corner. Bada bing, bada boom. And I can make it a guide layer. And that concludes this week's lesson. I hope that that was helpful. Okay, we'll keep going. We've got reference here that was called out that I have made into notes for the layer. So ground cracks, a couple shots, a power up, an explosion, and a title. Now, what the heck is this? Well, we need to look at some of the other elements. In my design folder, I have some type. It's gonna identify this superhero, and a location. Now this, I would call it a work of art, but that would be redundant. But let's take a look at this. So we've got kind of a halftone screen. I think that's what that's called from the print world on here. And it is a layered element with some self-illuminated items in here. There's the moon back there. And we got a lot of different layers, and probably if we were to go into Photoshop, each of these then also probably contains its own if we need to get granular. The main thing that I want to point out, this was made square, and it was made that way to allow camera moves. However, the camera moves in this case, I'm gonna say, are gonna be zooms. The reason for that, as we learned way back in the first lesson of the course, is there's a big difference between zooming and any kind of dolly push type of move, which is perspective. Now, to add perspective here, not only would I have to camera project this art onto matching geometry, but I'd have to separate out these poles. It could be done, but not really what we're after here. Just throwing it out there that you could look at this and decide you wanted to do that. Instead, I want to focus on where I'm positioning my talent in the shot, how we're going to frame it, given that we have all this room, and the practical elements that we're working with, because that is the main thing we're being asked to do here, is key the guy out and then add some pyrotechnical elements. So those are in this folder labeled Action VFX because that is who provided them for us. I went ahead and took all the clips that were labeled as matte and put them in a subfolder. So basically the way it works is, let's just take this one as an example. So here's an explosion, and for whatever reason, it is shot portrait, or at least it's saved out portrait. So the matching matte is something that they created for us. And this may or may not be usable. I'm mostly gonna be showing you how to do without these, because sometimes you don't have them, and then when you do have them, they've got specific drawbacks, but we are gonna make use of them. So let's just go back to looking at the regular layer. What I'm gonna do to skip ahead is pre-select my elements and populate them in here. But I wanted to show you that what we were given is just a bunch of different things. So for example, at the beginning where we see ground cracks, we have a ground crack element. Now, when you first look at these elements, it's worth not only seeing what they are and taking a look at their mats, but also checking things like what's the frame rate. So in this case, it's come in with a 60 frame per second frame rate. Now, that means that if I just drag it in here, 60, 24, they have common denominators, but they are not directly divisible by one another. You don't get an integer if you divide 60 by 24. So we get kind of an uneven frame rate, which probably doesn't matter that much. More to the point, how fast do we want this thing happening? I think at 60, maybe feels a little fast, but on the other hand, this is the type of effect, as will be a lot of these, they happen in an instant. And so it may be appropriate to just leave it there. But at this point, I could either make all the elements one frame rate so that they're uniform. And the way to do that would be to go to interpret footage and assign, say, my actual frame rate for the comp. And then having done that, I would remember that and paste it to all the rest, including the mats. And now, if I play it back, it's gonna be as if it's in slow motion, which is a little weird. But we're gonna be using time remapping. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that is my starting point here. So I'll lay in that one, and you're gonna have the option with your own exercise to make your own selections as well. For the shots, we have things like muzzle flash from an Uzi, and then we've got some hits. So where the bullet hits something, we've got spark hits, and we've got wall hits. Ooh, yeah, that's pretty nice. So that's like plaster blown out and stuff like that. And then we get into the more mystical stuff, the power up, which I believe is from anime. And so the power up is gonna be an imaginary thing that's gonna use, I did notice something pretty nice for that. This spell hit, what is this? Ooh, okay. So it's like an explosion, but one with mystical powers. And then for the actual explosion, which I labeled explodes, we've got some propane explosions. And so this is Burning Man type stuff. And we've also got a fireball element. Very cool. Now, I'll get into explosions a little bit, but one thing to notice right off the bat is these are gaseous. They don't have matter in them. And in this case, this is kind of a magical thing we're doing, so that's perfectly appropriate. But there are cases where if you're blowing something up, a propane explosion can be kind of limited because it looks very airy and light. So that's kind of explosions 101. Is it a gaseous explosion or does it have a lot of chunks in it? And you can always add chunks to gaseous and split the diff a bit. And then at the end here, we're gonna have our title. So I'm gonna do a bit of basic setup and come back. This is a green screen to be pulled and some basic just laying in of elements and so on. Motion graphics artists are well aware of the paradox that although everyone appreciates the nuance in your final result, a lot of the work is done just in blocking in and basically timing elements and putting them into place. And I've actually now ended up spending quite a bit of time not just selecting my elements, but also putting them into my timeline. And not only that, but because with his action of how he shoots, I needed to move him back so that he can hit some things in the scene. I added another comp where I do my camera moves, except they're not really camera moves. They're zooms, and then, well, rather than me describing it, let's take a look. So what we have here is a zoom in, or rather zoom out, and then a zoom back in. and then we move to the right. And I'm calling these zooms again because there's no perspective shift. Technically, there should be one when we do this move, but I'm considering this to be a stylized thing with the title coming in. And I'm not worrying about the fact that there should be parallax between him and that background. It's not really bothering me right now. Maybe later I'll change my mind. Oh, and I put my audio layer in here just so I'm going to be working in the assemble comp here. So this is basically my review and final comp as well. One thing, when we do these moves and the zooms, I do want there to be motion blur. And you notice I can't enable that here, even though I do have it enabled for the comp. Another thing I wanted to point out before I solve that problem is that I went ahead and made this comp HD, which is our final. But the assemble, I actually made 4K. I scaled it up from where I started with this footage. And that's basically just so that for all these zooms and everything, I'm never getting myself into trouble going over 100%. So with these basic scales, that's not happening. But if I want the motion blur, because I have collapse transformations enabled, I have to go in here and turn it on for all of these layers. So with them all selected, oops, except for that one, I can turn them all on. Now this one at the bottom has the same setting. This is my matte painting. It is scaled above 100, so technically I should have it using collapse transformation so that I keep the maximum amount of resolution. However, because I'm then scaling it back down in half, I'm not gonna worry about that. So I'm gonna turn it off here, and that will allow me to just happily have motion blur on. These kind of collisions do come up sometimes, and you have to kind of logic out your choices there. But going from 4K to 2K gives us quite a bit of wiggle room. Now, as you can see, I've color-coded my sort of sub-sequences within this one shot, and we're gonna be going through each one of them one by one. But to show you what I've done so far, I'm gonna show you a trick that I like to use when I'm looking at someone else's project, or even my own, when I'm trying to figure out what the heck I did. And that's to select all the layers, click UU, and it reveals everything that I've adjusted in the properties. So looking this over, you can see that I have basically only adjusted transformations. Of course, I worked out the timing. I've done trims to get things timed so they're entering at the right time. Timing-wise, I've left almost everything at its 100% time stretch, which we're gonna change because remember, I set these all to 24 FPS. So they're gonna run kind of slow right now. But that's my starting point. The ground explosion, I went ahead and changed to 25% here, so it's running quite a bit faster. It just really wasn't looking right and it was hanging around too long. That's the only one of those I changed. But anyway, the Uber key is showing you that I've scaled and positioned things, rotated them in some cases, and adjusted the anchor points. And the anchor points are carefully adjusted here as a time saver. And this is a can that people sometimes kick down the road and it costs you a lot of time. So for example, these hits over here, if I select one of these and reveal the settings, there's my anchor point. And what that means is if I rotate this element, it's gonna rotate from where that is emanating from. So like it's got a source and that's where I put my anchor point. And I already put that into play with my muzzle flash, although I didn't animate it yet, so it's not following his finger. And you're seeing these as black squares because I haven't done anything to either matte or use blending modes or anything. We're gonna get into that. At the end here, I did apply some blending modes. Specifically, you can see add mode on these fire elements. Add is gonna be your basic way to comp fire. And you see the benefit of it is you don't have to matte it and it already looks gaseous. And you also see the disadvantage, which it's looking a little thin, a little insubstantial. So we're gonna be working with that. But as a starting point, I just did that because otherwise it would be blotting out my whole scene since these end up being, particularly this fireball ends up being a full frame element. It actually took quite a bit of time to prep all that. So I saved us time in class doing it, but don't expect it to be automatic. An important part of this whole process is choosing your elements, getting them lined up and timed out and roughed in, and getting where we're at right now to the point we're at. That said, it's mostly a lot of editorial decisions. And as you saw, all of the adjustments I'm making at this point are very rudimentary. I also went ahead and keyed the footage ahead of time. And I just thought I'd give you a peek at that and what we're going to do with it. Now, the key on this one was pretty involved, and so I'm going to take an extra step that I haven't really done before. When I say involved, what I have in my setup here is 3 copies of the same keying operation where I separated the upper and lower parts of him as we've done before. Oh, by the way, one thing I wanted to throw out there, when you do this, if you ever see a line where the mats overlap like that, just switch your top layer to alpha add, and that will remove that. And then the way that I did the overall mat was my 3-pass method, where I've got a garbage mat on the outside that has a stencil alpha, so that's a spread out mat. You might have seen the green around him in that other view, like that. And then the main key, and then a core mat to just fill in holes. And then I've got spill suppression over the whole thing. Now, this takes a while to render. I noticed when I was previewing it, it was pretty slow at full resolution. And so what I'm gonna do is actually reveal this in the project. I'm gonna right click and choose Create Proxy Movie. Now, the default settings on this are designed to let you make a dirty version. The render settings are at draft, low-grade QuickTime output, and so we're just gonna change that. I'm gonna change this to best. When I twirl down here under output module, see where it says set proxy down here? Let me spread this out a little bit more. That's what is gonna make this thing come back in as a proxy. The thing is, I don't want this custom QuickTime format. I want TIFF sequence with alpha. And more than that, under format options, I want to make sure I've got LZW compression on. Now, if you don't have this preset, you can make it. So this is just RGB plus alpha with LZW compression. Why that? Well, PNG is also good for this, but basically, this is a lossless way to save my matte and foreground, which also will run length encode all of the basically empty pixels. And so the file won't really be that big for being completely uncompressed. So it's a really good compromise. So now I have to save this somewhere. I've made a proxy folder. So to keep things organized, I'll just give it a name similar to the project so I know where it belongs. I'll call it FGGS key, green screen key. 4 digits is fine. So these hashes, if you've never rendered out an image sequence or just saying how it's going to be numbered, I can reduce it to 3. And now let's render, and I'm gonna speed you through this. Now, I didn't get a proxy out of that. And the reason is that I didn't go back here and set the post-render action to create proxy. So when I changed to custom TIFF sequence, it blew that setting away. It's a very common mistake, but there are a couple ways around it. You can go change the preset for proxies. I'll show you how to do that. So under here, I say make template. Under movie proxy default, I'll just switch this to TIFF sequence with alpha. And I don't need the new setting, so I'll delete that. And so now when I create a proxy, it will actually use that and I won't have to change it. But since I blew it, I'm gonna say set proxy, just go where I was and open that TIFF sequence. Now here's one of those cases where you get an alpha channel question and you can always say guess. It's gonna evaluate the threshold pixels for whether they have background in them, which these would, so I got that right. Now the red bar tells me that a proxy is enabled for this comp, which is great. And I won't see that bar in my main comp, which is where we want to do the rest of our work. The name of the game with practical elements is integration. Let's face it, a lot of artists, After Effects, Photoshop, what have you, when faced with some images that are either maybe without an alpha channel, or maybe they have one, but it doesn't help you make it not look like this kind of clay thing with ground cracks in it, or they look at fire and don't necessarily know how to deal with it. That's what we're going to get into now, and I'm going to give you some guidelines of how the pros do it. And these are really important to know because it's a great sign if you know how to do this stuff, and a pretty bad sign in visual effects if you don't know. And now for the integration. I have a couple of options here. There initially was this footage, which is an MP4 of the ground crack over black, and there was a separate alpha channel image for just this holdout area supplied by Action VFX. And I could use that, but I inquired a little further and found that I could also get an EXR image sequence. And that's what I'm gonna use. And I'm not gonna break it open just yet as a full EXR. Right now, I'm mostly using it just to take advantage of the fact that it's already matted, but we may revisit this question. So I'll just delete the MP4, and the way that I'm going to integrate this, there are multiple options, but I'm going to go with overlay mode. And overlay mode, you could think of it as kind of a mixture between multiply and add, or darken and lighten. And so middle gray counts for a lot here. So to integrate this a bit more, I'm going to pull out the levels effect and watch what happens. There's a couple things I want to do. I want more contrast, and I also just want it not to even be making a discolored pool around the edges. So if I bring up the black contrast, that's making it nice and dark. And then if I bring down the contrast white gently, that's about the amount of contrast I wanted. And then I just mess with the gamma just a little bit. And at some point, you'll never know I was there. Now, if I solo the element for a moment and just look at my info panel, you can see that the blue levels are slightly higher and the red levels are slightly lower. So if it's looking a little bluer in there, I could go into the blue and just mess with blue gamma just a little bit. Go into red, do the same in the opposite direction. And that pretty much covers up my fingerprints. So that already looks pretty good, right? But wait, there's more. Below this layer, I'm gonna add an adjustment layer. So I'll select the background and under layer, select new adjustment layer. There is of course a shortcut. And this is gonna be called displacement. Under the distort menu, I'm gonna choose displacement map. And as my map source, I'm gonna go to that same ground crack layer. And let's just see what happens if we crank this a bit. So, I mean, we could really glitch out here, but all I want to do really is just disrupt things. Now, there are areas that are getting this where I don't want it, and there's a reason for that. The simple explanation is that my displacement map is not the same size as the overall comp. And so the effect is looking at the layer as if it were the same size as the comp, or rather, as the same size as the layer which it's being applied to, which is the same size as the comp. So all I need to do is pre-comp. I'll move everything into the new composition. I don't need to open it, and I'll just call it ground crack adjusted. And I just need to once again set overlay mode. Now the displacement is only affecting the area where that map lives, and it's too much. So the way this works is it uses a couple of color channels to disrupt pixels in specific directions. So it's really a cheat. It's looking at the red pixels and saying, okay, we'll move those. The more red it is, the more we'll move it horizontally 9. And more red, I mean the more bright the reds are. So really, this is a pretty grayscale map. So it's not really differing red to green in this case. So there are other cases where that would help you out. I think we may get to that at some point in this course because it's a good way. In fact, we may get to it in this specific lesson because it's how you make heat haze. But right now, it's all grayscale. The point is I'm just choosing how much to displace in horizontal and vertical direction. the vertical's not reading as strongly. So main thing is that where the ground is all disrupted, I want to see some disruption of that yellow line, and that is happening likewise with the white lines on the side. So I'm going to call it good. So there's a case where we were working with a 3D element that is unshaded. And if you work on your own, it might not occur to you that you don't actually have to solve any of the shading in 3D, and that you could do it all in comp like this. And on the whole, it gives you a lot more control to do it that way, since you're having to integrate it in comp anyway. So now, having done that with the 3D element, let's take a look at some actual practicals. Now on this frame, our challenge, at least initially, is clearly make the black go away from the foreground. And this is something you've no doubt run into before, and I'm sure you're aware there's more than one way to do it. I'm gonna focus on a way you might not know about. So first of all, the muzzle flash. One thing I wanna point out about muzzle flashes, you don't need to buy them. This is not actually that difficult a thing to paint. 3 different colors of orange, and then what we're gonna do with it, with an element like a muzzle flash, the perfect thing to do is just add it. And now you can see there is a lot of color variant, but there's also quite a bit in the background, and nobody knows what it's supposed to look like. It only goes by for 1 frame. Any muzzle flash, by the way, should just be 1 frame. Therefore, you could paint this. So those are 2 tips already. Let me also add some keyframes here. Option P gives me a position keyframe, Option R for rotation, and let's go to the second hit right here. And I'll just switch to my pointer and move that into place. I think these both need to be angled up a little bit. Something like that. Muzzle flash done. Now, let's see about these bullet hits. So in this case, add mode's not actually a very good choice. So let's just try this one with add mode, strawman argument. So not at all what we want. They're supposed to look like dust coming out of the wall. They're too big, but that's okay for now. So we're not gonna use add. We are also not gonna luma key, which you could do. But if you do that, you're bound to get fringing, and it's just gnarly. And you don't need to. What you can do instead is go over here to your effects and presets. And I'm gonna type in molt. So let's forget about text and forget about image special effects. So just focus on these 2. Unmold is actually a free effect that I added. Red Giant is the developer of this. It's actually goes way back. It's a Knoll software plugin from the 90s that's been updated and has always been a freebie because it's so useful. But I don't even expect you to go to Red Giant software and download that, which you certainly can. However, I want to show you what it does. So I'll just double click, and there are no settings. All it did was remove the black and leave the color. And I'm free to adjust the color further and so on. But that's all it did. I'll undo that, and let's go with alpha from lightness, parentheses unmold. And this is under presets, animation presets, so image utility. So this is where Adobe has put together effects into these useful little utilities for you. And so let's try this one. Well, this is looking somewhere in between the 2 things we saw. It's more solid than add mode, but it's washed out and bright like that was. The problem that I have with this effect is basically that it uses shift channels lightness, and it doesn't help to choose a different option. Luminance is basically the same thing in most cases. It would help in this case to choose red because these elements are predominantly red. So again, if you weren't looking, that was before and after. So you can see that if I made this red, in this case, that would work better, but that's such a kludge. Let's not do that. So I'm gonna undo everything. Actually, I'm not gonna undo everything. I'll leave the effect, but I'm gonna make a change. So we're gonna go into channel. Under here, there is an effect that unfortunately is marked as 8-bit called channel combiner. But I'm not gonna worry about the fact that it's 8-bit right now. I'm just gonna move it in here, turn off shift channels, and I ruined it. But what I have to do is change this to max RGB. So I'm getting the maximum, which in this case is using the red because it is the most prominent. I'm not going to send that to lightness. I'm going to send it to, you guessed it, alpha. And by the way, we're not looking at a very great looking frame, but just compare as we move ahead and we get more of the, see, it's just looking a lot better. And I can make it look even better than that. I'm going to get rid of shift channels. And I could save, by the way, I could save my own animation preset with this setting instead of the Adobe one. And yeah, the warning sign's up there that it's 8-bit, but most of the time that's not going to mess you up because the type of elements you're applying it to aren't going to be high dynamic range color. That's my excuse anyway. Another thing I'm going to have to change here is the timing, because obviously I set these to 23.976 frames per second, and that's just going to be too slow. They should happen fast and they should be short. So let's just solo them, and we can leave in the background for a second. And let's see what we can do here. Now, before I go on and loop a preview of this, I want to make a quick point here. I'm working at half res, which is fine because I'm just previewing elements, but I've got my other elements showing in the scene. I've got the gunfire and the ground cracks, which are an EXR, so it's a heavy element. And I've got my green screen key, which I actually proxied, so that one's performing pretty well. The ground crack, I'm not willing to proxy. I want to keep it as is. Therefore, I have another option besides soloing layers to speed things up, and that is to use a region of interest. So that's this little button right down here. And this region of interest is big enough that it would include some of the ground crack. And you might think, well, where it was, it's only a little bit. In Nuke, that would help you, because Nuke is a scanline renderer and it only looks for what is in the exact area of frame where you're looking, basically. But in After Effects, it doesn't really work like that. When you have part of an element showing, AE is going to still look at that whole element to render it. So if I'm suspicious that my ground crack is slowing things down, what I can do is make the ROI be way outside where that is. Now, will that work? Well, let's give it a try. Let me come back here. I'm also gonna just start my animation right there. And I really only need every other frame. This is long-winded. ROI is very quick if you ever wanna speed things up. And again, it's just for when I have a lot of elements like this. Let's see what it does. Okay, well, things were chugging. They're still chugging a bit. So that may or may not have helped, but it would help for cases like I just outlined. It's possible that that ground crack is actually really still occupying this part of the frame, even though it's masked out here. I don't know that fine a point about how these work. Regardless, let's evaluate. And what I see is that my 3 bullet hits are about 4 times too large and about a quarter the speed they need to be. And those are both going to be easy to adjust. The other question you might have is, why are there 3 when we only had a couple muzzle flashes? Well, the muzzle flashes can happen on frames where we didn't have the camera pointed on them, or bullets can be fired without a muzzle flash. So those are both good reasons. The sound effect had more than 3 bullets being shot, so I'm just going with this. And this is still, pretty simple way to do it. All I want to do to improve it in a simple way is to go in here. Now remember, I set the anchor points to the base. You can see them there. So to go 1/4 the size, I just take 20%, make it 5. Actually, that's another tip. Hold on, let me undo that. I can also, if the math were hard, which it's not in this case, I could say 20/4, 20 divided by 4, and that also would do that. And let's see if the same thing works in stretch. So I want to stretch it to 25%, which is 100 divided by 4, and that also worked. It works almost everywhere in After Effects to do that. All right, let's preview it again. I'll probably tweak the color, but that's the basic idea. I don't know if they're perfectly placed. It's the basic idea. So the stuff we're learning right now is not technically all that hard. It's just not common knowledge. And if you didn't know some of these approaches, you might really struggle with kind of the more on the nose kind of means, like pulling a lot of keys and stuff. And often with these types of practical effects, blending modes and other effects or pipelines that help you deal procedurally without pulling a manual key or pulling out rotor brush, what have you, tend to be the ones you want to use. Once again, I skipped ahead just a little bit to get through some of the tedious setup. I want to update you now on what I did. A hue and saturation effect applied to these bullet hits gets them better integrated, but they're still popping. So I'm happy about that. I am going to take the somewhat radical, in motion graphics terms, step of pre-comping. Just as I did with my green screen, I'm calling this an element, and I'm not going to pre-render it this time, but I'm going to just get rid of extra layer stacks in my timeline because I'm calling it done. So we'll call this shots 1, and that's all good other than the fact that I want it to still be green. And also, I've lost my blending mode, so we need to enable this toggle right here, and now transformations are collapsed. And my work area is now set to the next shot, and I've done some work on this one. So I got my add modes happening for the muzzle flash as well as up here, which is where we're gonna focus. And then what I've done is gone in, because we're gonna be shooting out the light. So you can see the first spark goes off the top here, and I may decide much later, in fact, I think I'm probably gonna decide a little sooner that that needs to be a little more visible. Probably it should be bright orange, perhaps. But what I really want to focus on right now is this transition that's going to knock out this light, including the back pane of glass. Really both panes of glass, but since you hardly see one in the front, I'm just going to say all the glass gets shattered in the same direction as this muzzle flash. So this is going the opposite direction of those bullet hits in the wall. This is sparks traveling the same direction as the bullet. So what I have done here, in order to see it, we've got to look at my poles layer. So I added this poles layer. In fact, I made it purple to match the background because it is actually part of the background. I just brought it forward in order to composite it with the scene. Let's open it up. And again, I've highlighted the layer in question. And then you can see the timing of what I did over here. So within the Photoshop comp, there were 4 layers, 3 of which I have animated to participate here. So the main light, the glow, and that pane of glass, which is now masked out, are all changing as a result. Simple enough. So now we need some shattering glass. And I've got a glass shatter layer. Not very precise, really just matching the right edge. Good enough. And when I show you what I'm doing, at first you're gonna think this was the wrong way to set it up, but there is some method to this madness. I'm gonna use the shatter effect, or as I like to call it, Shatner. And what the heck just happened? Well, if you're not familiar with this effect, this is gonna look a little confusing. Let me solo this. So what's happening is there is shattering happening in the area of that ball in the middle. And then what you see is this elaborate grid. And this is designed for a much larger layer. So what we're gonna do is make adjustments to this. We want fewer repetitions, maybe more like 5. We don't want this brick pattern. Let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see it. Let's go full res too. There we go. So instead of the default bricks, we're gonna go with triangles for shards of glass. To make the magic happen here, I'm gonna be adjusting the force, but the first question is why the simulation is already partly done. And that's because it's not acknowledging where I trimmed the layer. It wants to start at the beginning of the comp. And there you can see the shattering happening. But what I alluded to earlier is it's confined to the area of just this layer. So I could have masked off a bigger layer, but instead what I'm gonna do is use the grow bounds utility. Just stick this up at the top and I can make it as big as I like. In fact, I can make it into the thousands. And now those particles are going to fall outside the original layer. Magic. What the heck just happened? Grow bounds is actually such a bizarre black magic kind of thing. And if you think about it in terms of any other compositing program, it's really, really simple. Let's start with what we started with, which is just a layer with really pretty small proportions inside a comp with very large proportions. Now, you and I both know any effect we apply to that layer is just going to be applied to that layer. And that includes a particle simulator like shatter. All that grow bounds is really doing is just expanding the area where anything below it in the effects stack is going to calculate. It's something you would just completely take for granted if you were working in Nuke or any other nodal-based compositor. So let me just kind of zoom in here. I'm going to hold down Shift key and bring this back into range to where it has a direct effect on what we're seeing. So now, if I just kind of swipe through here, you can really easily see where the boundary is, and it is just expanding out on X and Y from that layer. And for the most part, this can really add to your flexibility and get you out of a jam. And so in this case, my alternative would have been to instead make the solid the entire size of the frame, or at least big enough to cover the area where I want the glass to shatter. But I didn't do it that way because I wanted to be really specific about where the shatter starts without using a mask and so on. So now let's look at adjusting the force and the physics, because right now it looks like the glass is falling straight down and I need it to shoot in that direction. So sometimes it's easier to manipulate things from the numbers. I'm just going to move this one down to, well, let's just make it 0. So that'll be the left edge. And I'll increase its radius quite a bit so that it encompasses the frame. It doesn't have to necessarily be larger than the frame. I just want to knock out all the glass. And then the strength, I think I'm going to max out. And for now, I'm just working with it at the beginning of the comp. There we go. All right, well, that's good, but it's flying off in all directions with no gravity. So let's add a little more gravity. So the gravity was too strong when the force was weaker, but now more like that, I think. I'm gonna let it roll and then check the framing and timing. So it's still too slow, and I've gone with the max amount of force. And the triangles are getting really weird when they get farther away. Well, one thing I discovered is I have a way to control that, because by lowering grow bounds back down to closer to the layer size, I can restrict these things to just that area up there, and no one will be the wiser. These shards are just gonna kind of go out of sight and out of mind. So I'm gonna use the left square bracket to move this up, and that, rather than trimming the layer, even though visually you can't see any difference, actually allows the thing to start here. However, to speed it up, I'm gonna pre-comp. So call this glass shatter speed, because that's the reason that I made the pre-comp. And I'll go ahead and open it, but first thing is here, let's make it, let's say a stretch factor of 50. See if that's good enough. Yeah, still could be a bit more violent than that even. Go with 25 or even 10. Let's see what 10 does. All right, 10 might be a little too much. You can't even see it, but about 20. Yeah, now obviously these are currently wireframes. So make this one yellow and then go back here, and you can change this. The default is wireframe to make it render faster. We can go with rendered glass, and I could make it a little bluish right here, but I could do that later if even need be. I'll unsolo it and let's see how it looks. So that's more or less what I was after. There is kind of a cutoff there. Let me just mess with it a little bit more. Just give it a little more room. And then I do think it needs some tint. I'm gonna use that exact effect. Get the white from this kind of bluish white right here, and then we'll turn this a bit blue. In fact, let me just get this from the environment. Yeah, like that. And so once again, in order to call this done, I'll pre-comp it. Now, I didn't mess around with the shading. By default, it's using a distant light. You could throw in a point light instead, but really this whole thing is so cartoonish. But there are some more things, despite that this shatter effect is ancient, that you can do. Anyhow, let's just call that one done as well. Once again there, we have integrated a 3D element rather than a practical. But honestly, for something like breaking glass, chatter's crude, it's very old, doesn't do anything very sophisticated. But for a simulation like this, perfectly adequate, and once again, saving you a lot of trouble when you imagine what it would take to either match a practical or maybe even go to more lengths to 3D model this. Not always totally adequate, but in this case, I would say so. Now, the next item in here is marked Power Up, and that means it could be anything. I looked this up, and it seems to be from anime, and the examples that I saw tend to have a lot of energy, and it often happens in like a cone or a cylinder or a cyclone. And so I think what I want here is, in addition to this magical element that starts off looking like a fireball and then, I don't know, goes all unicorn here at the end, I want some more color. So I'm gonna just spend a little time setting up and prepping some elements, but keep in mind, this could be anything. So I'll work for a little while, and then I will probably skip to the end and show you where I got to. For the sort of column kind of look, we know how to do that. So to prep it, I'll pre-comp this spell. And there it is. Now, I'm not sure why there's so much extra space in here, but let's just get to the point where it's most spread out. I'm gonna open scale, and I'm gonna scale this thing up, and I'm even gonna non-uniformly scale it so that it's wider than it is tall, something like that. And then back in the main comp, I will add CC Cylinder, our star from Screenless. And there we go. Well, let's see. So this is definitely gonna be an add mode kind of feeling here. And that's all fine. The radius needs to come down so that it's roughly the area that he's kind of embracing here. Just scoot it over a little bit. And let's just take a look at how this thing animates on. I'm gonna do that in the pre-comp. So it goes right from the center. And it really quickly, just over a few frames, expands to full size and then does its little dance. So just that is already kind of a cooler idea than where we started. And now really I'm just gonna build on this. It's gonna be like theme and variation on that. And it's gonna pop on, but I actually kind of feel like I'm okay with that. Now let's just make a couple more elements. And remember, this is just me freestyling. So I'll make one called lightning, and that should be comp size. It doesn't matter with the color because I'm going to apply lightning. So there's two flavors of lightning. I'm gonna go with advanced. They're both 8-bit. All we really gotta do here is set the origin below and the direction above. And then let's just mess around with the turbulence and the forking and then the decay. Yeah, something like that. Let's see if it animates. So the thing that makes this an advanced plugin is that it doesn't animate by itself. And you know, a long time ago, that would have made this very tricky to use, but we know what to do, right? So animating the conductivity state is going to make things happen with this. And I think I can make it branch out a little bit more. Let's see if I increase the turbulence, and let's just animate this conductivity state. And let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's the kind of idea. Now, let's just see what this looks like underneath that other layer. So I think I want it to be either contained in there or somehow also participating in the cylindrical feel. So once again, I'll pre-comp this. Let's just take the scale and non-uniformly make it really wide. Make sure we're sort of staying within bounds here. Yeah, that's the idea. And once again, over here, we need the cylinder effect. In fact, I'll just borrow the other one. Use add mode again. This time I want a larger radius. So let's go with like, I don't know, 30. Yeah, and it's gonna have to be shifted over to match. Go with 35. Okay, now that, once again, is not animating. Oh, I see what keeps happening. Pre-comping, I can see why you guys complain about it. Just kidding, I complain about it. The simpler way to do this would be with an expression, and then I wouldn't have this problem, right? So let's do that. It's gonna be time, and time is measured in seconds. So the way I had it, I'm not even sure how much it was progressing, but let's just say times 10. Let's see what we get there. It's gonna be chaotic movement no matter what. And then, dope. And now one more. Here is a lovely explosion element. Turn off these other solo layers. So it's gonna get the same treatment. Pre-comp it, and this one's going to be fire for power up. And I call it fire because what I'm really interested in the orange color here, I've already got secondaries going on. Like I've got a green and kind of a purple, greenish, purplish. So we're gonna go orangish now. And for this guy, once again, widen it out so that we can cylindricalize it. And then over here, grab that cylinder effect again and paste it up here. And then widen this out again, maybe to 45 this time. Now with add mode, layer order doesn't actually matter. So it's really a competition for which one is the brightest in any given channel as far as what comes through in here. You can barely see my talent back there. Let me pre-roll a little bit and just see what we've got. The basic idea is awesome. And now what I'm gonna dial in is things like opacity, softness, add a little blur. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and do that, not on camera, just because it's a little slow and noodly. And I'll show you when I'm done. Skipping ahead, I have exposed here everything I did, which was really simple. For the fire element, I have it animating in for opacity from 70% so that he's not quite so whited out toward the beginning. I want to still be able to see his motion even though I want it to be white hot. And then I have the fire element time remapped so that it quickly extinguishes at the end. The lightning has this mask that you can see exposed, which animates up and down. And it's very soft. It has a 200 pixel feather on the y-axis. And that is going to be my core element, those three things. I think I scooted them over to the left a little bit too to just get them fully lined up. Now, having done that, I'm going to pre-comp them. I can trim this one down and take the three of them, and we'll call this power up element. And I have a couple of reasons for doing this. I don't need to open it. Add mode. There's a couple of reasons I wanted to pre-comp. One, I think I want to scale this thing down horizontally just a little bit, all the elements. The other thing is that I want to do some displacement on him. So I'm going to use this as a displacement map. And right above the talent layer, I'll add an adjustment layer. And this is going to be called displace. We're going to just trim it so that it's the same length as the displacement layer right above it. And to that layer, I apply distort displacement map. And I alluded to that I was maybe going to do this. So I will choose it in this menu, power up element, and let's just turn that layer off so we can see what's happening. Let's make it a little stronger. I'm going to go with, what the heck, negative numbers this time. -10 in both directions. And let's see what that gives us. Yeah, so what I'm wanting is the feeling that this thing is creating heat distortion on him behind there. Yeah, and that's going to do it. Let's take a look. There's a little bit of a jolt when that cuts in, so maybe I need to animate it on. The other thing I want to do is just soften this element just a bit. And I'm going to use a very crude fast box blur of about 20. And as you can see, there were probably 24 different decisions in there that could have been made differently. And then there are about 1 million other things I could have done with this. Looks like I need to animate that thing off as well. But that's just housekeeping. All right, well, for now, that is that. And we're gonna move on to the final thing and any touch up. So this is one of those elements, if I'd had to do it over again, I probably would have come up with a whole different approach just to keep myself kind of engaged and interested. As you could tell, Some of my choices were arbitrary and done completely by intuition and feel. But in the end, what I was going for was something that would feel like it's got some real practical energy to it, like everything we're doing in this scene. Now I want to show you how I did the ending. Here is part 1. And this kind of looks like A over B, the fireball element added over the background. But in fact, it's been sweetened a little bit. Here is a fireball with add. I have just 3 layers soloed here. And that one has nothing else on it. It is just the raw element in add mode at 100% opacity. So if I turn that off, I'm left with a kind of weird looking element. But this one I am using to provide a hue underneath the adds. The add is basically adding that orangey, fiery quality to this element. And this one has unmold applied. So if I solo it, it doesn't look like much over the checkerboard. It has an alpha channel. And both of these layers are also time remapped so that the ball comes roaring out, the fireball comes roaring out fast and also dissipates fast. So it comes quickly to a peak and quickly goes away. And the opacity adjustment was made relative to that add layer above it and the background behind. So it was all kind of tuned. And I was just kind of feeling like without that layer behind, I'll show you, it just looks orange and thin. And so by using a layer with unmold, I get to thicken up the fire, and unmold doesn't give me matte edges, and I'm not relying just on the unmold layer. So kind of getting the best of both worlds here. Often I would go with just the 100% opacity add mode fire element, but in this case it's looking too gaseous, and yet I want to see the scene behind. I think you're getting what I'm meaning. Let me turn both of these off and show you also the background, which is just getting interactive lighting. So it's just an additional touch there. So the other layers I've added in here as part 2 are adding ambience. And one of them is pretty minor and the other one is big, and I want you to know about it. Let's get the ground explosion out of the way first. So again, I've time remapped this to give it a specific kind of aggressive timing. And so as it comes in, it's filling in this hole here. You can see it there. I've given it, again, a kind of rosier color. So it's kind of like the heart, if you will, of the explosion. It's just filling in a gap that appeared and really at one point seemed very significant, and then now is really playing a supporting role. You know how those things go. And I animated the hue and saturation just because at one point I wanted it to be much rosier, and then I wanted it to fade in and out of being more orange. Compound blur. To show you this one, I'm actually going to turn off these others and just turn on this one plus that ambient lighting that I showed you on the background. So see this blur growing out of the center? It's growing out of the center the same way the fireball does, and the reason for that is that it is actually set to use that fireball layer as a reference for the blur. It's using the luminance, and so the overall luminance of the fire, where it's brighter, it's blurring more. Why do this? Well, this is how heat in air behaves. At least this is what I understand. There's a heck of a lot of water in air, and when it heats up, you get steam, and it is natural to see this blurring behind fire. We looked at heat ripple before, but here this is a different phenomenon where we are just blurring things out as they do behind heat, and it just kind of looks right, and it very neatly follows that fireball. Compound blur is useful for any situation where you need some ambient steam, foggy kind of feeling. So if you're adding fog around the Golden Gate Bridge, maybe that's also going to have a little compound blur behind it. But heat elements like this really look right if you add it. And then the displacement that we were doing before, that kind of heat haze, is something that you might see within or above a fiery element. And they're both really fun to play around with. So the next thing I did was just get in and adjust and animate the time remap and the opacity of those elements a little bit so they're really tight with the title coming in. I really wanted to just go woof and then reveal the title. The next thing that I also added is just a simple contact shadow for his feet, and that's just so he doesn't seem to be floating. It's been a question whether I need to deal with the shifting ground to further get him embedded into this element. And for now, I'm just relying on the shadow to do that for a couple different reasons. One is this pretty stylized background. And so the question, of course, is, are any of the rocks covering his feet to where I actually somehow need to deal with that? And it looks like no to me. Now, looking at the final shot, there's a problem, which you can clearly see here. The displacement map for the ground crack is off. It seems to be affecting lots of other parts of the frame that I didn't intend it to. Just one other thing I also noticed when we get in here, the motion blur is not being applied to everything. It's on him, but not on the background. There's a perfectly good reason this is happening, and it has to do with collapse transformations, which is set here. So if I turn that off, boom, motion blur's there, and that problem with the displacement map is gone. So you might think, great, let's just turn that off. But if you remember, the reason we turned it on was because of this gap that we had on the matte painting. So you might be thinking, can't we just pick and choose? Can't I have collapse transformations for the background, but not the displacement layer? And can't I get all the motion blur just kind of happening? To answer that question, I'm going to show the other scary thing. I've already shown expressions, which scares a lot of people, and timer mapping, which scares some people. But the very scariest thing you can open in After Effects is this view, the flowchart. You may never have seen this, and it kind of surprises me that we haven't actually looked at this yet. So under the hood, After Effects is actually a nodal compositing app, but its nodal view doesn't let you really do much. So when we collapse transformations, what we're saying is that all of these elements are going to be passed through, and you can't pick and choose some of them because this entire stack is just being passed through to the layer where we have collapse transformations on. And the specific issue, we don't need to keep looking at that, although if you really wanted to get freaky, let's keep opening it up. So imagine actually if you had to work with After Effects nodally, there'd have to be a lot more that you could actually do here. You can't adjust effects here. So really, this is just basically a way to appreciate how much goes into your shot and occasionally solve a logical problem. So you may have noticed that flowchart view, the node view of After Effects, lists the effects that are applied to a given layer, but of course doesn't give you any means to change anything about them or even open up the effect panel. Likewise, you can't do any timeline stuff, which is why we have the timeline. One thing that's less precise overall than with a node-based compositor is, if you noticed, all the layers were flowing into one other comp. So all the subcomps are considered equal. But in fact, the truth is in 2D, they're passing along one to the next, and they start at the bottom and go up. And you probably knew this, but it's worth keeping in mind, because when render order comes up, cases like this, it's helpful to know that in 2D, After Effects starts with the bottom layer and then goes top to bottom with all the twirl down, everything you can twirl down and see. So transforms below effects, which are below masks, and then it goes up to the next layer and does the same thing. 3D layers, of course, add a different wrinkle because they need to dynamically interact with each other in terms of which one is forward or back. That's maybe one reason not to show it this way in this view, but more to the point, this isn't truly representative of what's actually happening, which is an order of operations like you would see in Fusion or Nuke. Back in layer view, and whew, isn't that a relief? I'll remind you also that we scaled up the background matte painting. So before I make any adjustments, I will turn off the broken displacement layer. I'm gonna go back here, set this to full, and take a reference. My solution is gonna be to duplicate the Pyro City background and pre-comp it, and the pre-comp will be called Pyro City Displace. And having set that, I can take the effect from my displacement layer and apply it directly now, and then I'll just delete that other displacement layer. Now, if we go back into the zoomed in comp, I'm gonna go way in, so we're at full res. And you can see that, let's go outside of the displacement layer. The pixels are getting a little softer because of that 128% scale that's no longer getting passed through. So what I'll do, one more step, is give myself a track matte from the ground crack. Remember, this has an alpha channel. That's not gonna be perfect because there's this extra area out here that'll be affected, but the rest of the image is now identical. So the only change is down where I'm wanting the displacement. And that's assuming that that slight softening is bothering me. But in this case, it's avoidable. And it's part of the whole reason that we went down this road. Now, these render pipeline issues are tricky to say the least. And sometimes the only way to really figure out what's going on is just to stubbornly sit there and test things out, especially that A versus B kind of view that I was showing there, to just make sure I understood what was going on with the softening of the overscale. And that way, you don't get any bad surprises when somebody else notices a problem and you missed it, and then have to figure out how to fix it. Or even worse, it gets through and then later on you're like, ooh, I probably should have caught that. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Not to you. So we know that when collapse transformations is on, motion blur gets passed through. So it's turned on, we see it on him, but nothing's happening on the background. I'll select all the layers here, and I don't think there are any I need to not have with motion blur, so I'll just toggle them all on. That does not solve the problem. And the reason is, well, it partly solves the problem, but for example, certain elements are not participating. The reason for that is there is collapse transformations on some of these layers as well. So guess what? I've got to go into those and turn on motion blur for all of them as well. They do not, in turn, have another collapse transformation, so I don't have to keep going. But I do need to get all these, including the poles. And those are all collapsed. So at this point, you ask yourself, really? Yeah, really. So now that means these would all have to be turned on if I want to leave it set up this way. So I'll just finish that. Let's see if there's anything else left hanging out here. The shots, those are single layer and they already have motion blur turned on. So I'll take care of this little bit of housekeeping off camera and be right back. Once again, I could have turned off collapse transformations for each of those layers if I was feeling lazy about it, but they would have gotten a little bit softer because that whole comp is parented to the one that's getting scaled up to 128% before it's getting scaled down 50%. Now I've actually broken something that I had set up before, which is my interactive light. So I'm gonna do it again, and this time I'm actually gonna show you what I'm doing because a couple interesting things came up with it. I can use an adjustment layer for this. I know we just ran into a problem with adjustment layers, but this time I'm doing a color correction. I'll call it interactive light. it doesn't matter that it is a 4K adjustment layer. I'm gonna apply the exposure effect, and if I just use exposure, I'm just brightening up the background. I want it to be mostly red. I can do that by switching to individual channels and cranking up the red. Now to see what I'm doing, I'll go back to the beginning here. That's kind of the idea. I could make it even a bit stronger, but also I want to balance it out. So I'm going to pull back on the green exposure to give it a more orangey tint. Well, actually I need to come up, but not as much on green. How about that? And then where I'm going to pull back is actually with the blue to get it out of purple world. So let's have a keyframe for those at our peak, something like that frame. And I can use the U key to expose those keyframes. Then I'll go back to my first starting frame here, and I'll reset each of them to set it to a 0 keyframe. Copy those, go to the last frame of this section, and perhaps just add some eases as well. And let's take a look. So I haven't ever really worked on my Steve Jobs imitation, but that's gonna do it for now. But we have one more thing. The final kiss of love is a dust element to go with ground crack because it just doesn't look right without it. So it's a 4K dust element, trim it right there and find my starting point. So it's blacking out the frame. The solution that I'll use for this is the Null Unmult free plugin that I installed. I showed you the alternative. And where is his landing? It's right about there. Oh, and it should be right in front of him. All right, well, I will center it. I'm not sure what I think of the color, but I think I'm just gonna leave it. It is dust colored after all. And let's just see where we end up. Oh yeah, that is great. So visual effects, like motion graphics, is truly the art of the good enough. Is this done? Yes, in the sense that there's no longer anything that was really upsetting me that's now bugging me so much I can't just put a bow around this one. I say this because, again, the choices I made here were mine, and I really look forward to seeing what you guys do completely your own, given the same basic brief.